So welcome everyone to our first of many webinar series that will be covering pretty much everything as it relates to starting your cannabis business. I'm Derek Davis. I'm a CPA at GreenGrowth CPAs, and I'm also joined here with Chris Russell.
Hey everyone, Chris Russell here, Finance Manager at GreenGrowth CPAs. Pleasure to have everyone today. We're excited to share some information with you about the new aspects of the Los Angeles licensing package. We've been fortunate to support a large number of clients through the licensing process here in California and other states as well. We'd love to help you get a business started here in Los Angeles. For anyone looking to connect with us directly after this webinar, please visit the GreenGrowth CPA's website. You'll find the Get Started form there. Complete that form and our team will be in touch with you directly to learn more about your situation and how we can help support your business.
So with that, we will get started. So a little bit about us. We are a CPA firm. I've personally been licensed to practice accountancy in California since 2012, and I've been involved in the cannabis industry since 2010 when 280E first came out, and it was a big issue. This was also in conjunction with California trying to legalize cannabis and become the first state in the nation to legalize cannabis, but unfortunately that proposition failed. And so here we are today as a finally legalized market. So let's talk about cannabis in Los Angeles. Measure M, which was the most comprehensive overview regulation that was passed in March of 2017, and it pretty much gave the city council the full authority to regulate cannabis within the city of Los Angeles. As a result of Measure M passing, they also established the Department of Cannabis Regulations, and it's a 5-member committee that's responsible for the cannabis regulatory framework, as well as implementations, licensing, and all that good stuff. So some key aspects of Los Angeles's DCR is that they are responsible for the business application process, determination of the applicants, administering, as well as coordinating the auditing and inspection for licensed cannabis related businesses, and enforcing compliance. Compliance is really, really important, not only in Los Angeles, but across the nation as more states begin to pick up some form of regulatory framework. So it's really important that you thoroughly understand the rules and requirements, because those companies that are set up with a compliance-focused mind are those companies that will win. So this webinar will be specifically for phase 2 applicants. So those individuals who've been in the business prior to January 1st, 2016. And naturally, once phase 3 comes online, we'll do a webinar to cover that as well. Phase 2 will open according to the city on August 1st, and applications will become available on July 30th. So those are key dates to remember. And according to them, that phase 2 will be open from the beginning of August until the end of September. But quite honestly, I think phase 2 will go until the end of this year. It will be located at cannabis.lacity.org. If you're not too familiar, make sure that you check out those sites, because a lot of great information is detailed on there. This is really important, which is how large is your facility? If your facility is going to be over 30,000 square feet, you're going to have to go through a lot more processes, and you're going to have to get a lot more approval than if your building is under 30,000 square feet. So if you're looking at a couple buildings and you see something that's 28,000 square feet or 32, you have to really ask yourself, do you need that extra 4,000 of square feet? So these are generally the types of licenses that are available. So you have the type A, which is the adult use, or the type M, which is the medical use. For those of you that are teetering back and forth, what I would probably recommend is you look at other legalized states, let's say Colorado, for example, to see how sales have worked out after they've implemented full-scale legalization. What you'll generally find is adult sales will soon surpass by a factor of 2 to 3x medical sales. Why is that? Even though it's more expensive, is because it's easier. People are lazy. What we find is that people will generally not care to pay the additional taxes because it's just, they don't want to have to go and get a medical marijuana license. And one of the most important things to remember is that oftentimes to get out of the sales and use tax, you need to get the county issued medical marijuana ID card. So you have to go down the county, you have to apply, you have to give them a headshot. It's a huge and drawn out process that, let's say, 98% of people will not do because it's just too much work. I think it's generally safe from a sales and growth perspective to go after the adult market and potentially stay away from the medical market. So the types of commercial activity, you have the type 10, which is the retail. You have the type 9, which is non-storefront retail. And then you also have the type 1 through type 5 licenses. The one thing to make sure that you're aware of is that the city of Los Angeles generally does not allow for mixed use lighting. And if you're thinking about going for a cultivation license in Los Angeles, I would generally say don't do it. Why? LA is really expensive. Real estate is very, very expensive here. And what we're seeing with a lot of our cultivation related clients is that it's a drive to the bottom in terms of pricing. So, you're going to be operationally at a disadvantage and also financially at a disadvantage if you have to pay high rent, high electricity costs. You're using city water. It's usually more operationally efficient if you go to a lower cost jurisdiction. Let's say Humboldt County, Trinity County, Mendocino. Generally, land is cheaper there. You can get a well. And it's more efficient. So it kind of works hand in hand that LA is not the biggest fan of cultivation right now because it's also not financially secure. So additionally, there are some other license types that are available. The ones to consider is type 6, which is manufacturing, type 7, which is also manufacturing. The main difference is when you think about manufacturing is whether you're going to do volatile and non-volatile extraction. And then type N and type P. So type N and type P licenses are really fascinating. They also kind of fall in line with the type S. So these are like the co-working models such that you're rebranding, repackaging. Someone else is doing the manufacturing, but you have a strong consumer audience and you just slap your label on it and you push the products out. This is a really great way for people to get up and running without having to spend a tremendous amount on capital assets, especially when you look at extraction. Some of these equipments can run you between $500,000 and $1 million. So if you're on a little bit of a tighter budget, you may want to think about some of these alternative license types to just get your product out on the market, prove product market fit. And then from there, you can think a bit about going potentially downstream and doing your own manufacturing activities. The other types, of course, you have testing and distribution. The quick caveat on testing is that if you have a testing license and you own other license types, you cannot have more than 20% ownership in the testing license. The reason why California specifically did this way is they wanted to make sure that there was no conflict of interest with the testing as well as the production, right? Because if you're doing testing and production, you have a conflict of interest such that if your product fails, you can still say that it's approved, even though it's not, just to make sure that your product goes to market. So for that license type specifically, it has to remain as a separate entity. And so if you're thinking about, you want to also go into testing as well as manufacturing, distribution, branded products, you need to make sure either A, you don't have a majority interest in the non-testing activities, or you have a minority interest and non-management responsibilities in the testing company. So there's a lot of requirements that you have to abide by for the phase 2 licensing. And we'll cover them in kind of broad detail, but more specifically, we're happy to set up free consultation calls and go over the details with a little bit more description. We just want to make sure that for today's discussion, we cover the broad topics so people know where they stand. Applicants, they have to show that they've been in business prior to 2016, that they show due diligence with the required regulations. So, for example, the city of Los Angeles, depending on where you fall on the supply chain, you have to pay either 5% or up to 10% tax per $1,000 of gross receipts. The city of Los Angeles did bump down the rate slightly for medical licenses in terms of the amount of taxes that they have to pay. However, it's important to note that based on where we've seen historical sales of other legalized states, paying a little bit more in taxes, but being able to access a much broader market is generally worthwhile. So let's go over some of the requirements. You have to show where the physical address of both the business premise and the cannabis activity were located and where it was conducted. One of the most interesting aspects that came out of yesterday is that you could potentially apply for phase 2 without a location. Now, this is huge news, right? Because if you look at other cities, let's say West Hollywood or Culver City, you oftentimes have to show when you apply for a city license, you have to show that you either own the building or the landlord is okay with you operating cannabis on that facility. You need to have an architectural design layout. You have to have the security plan layout. You pretty much have to show exactly how this company will operate if it is granted the license. Now, that's generally a huge barrier to entry. And if you look at cities such as La Mesa and San Diego, the city took forever to roll out their actual licensing, almost a year. And so what happened is there was a big rush to apply for a license. You secured the lease, you started paying rent, and then the city just dragged its feet on licensing. As a potential business owner, you're losing money every single month by paying rent, and you don't know whether or not you're actually going to get the license. So this is really cool that the city of LA will potentially allow for you to apply without a physical presence established. That being said, though, if you do make it further down the application licensing stages, what will then end up happening is you'll, of course, have to show where your business will be located, the security plan, the fire and safety, and all that stuff. But you could potentially delay that a little bit. I personally like that approach just because I think it provides more flexibility and less risk. But it was slightly unclear if the city will pay preference to those that have a complete application. So, you go in and you apply, you have the building, you have the layout, you have the architectural plans, you have the security plans. It's not clear if they're going to allow preference for those types. Some other details, you'll have to have the address for the applicant, telephone number, website if applicable, obviously email address. Everyone who applies, all the owners of the business will obviously have to undergo a background check, and we'll cover that in a little bit more detail as it relates to the social equity part. And then you'll have to make sure that there's not undue concentration in certain neighborhoods. Let's say in the warehouse district of downtown LA, they don't want to have 15 cannabis operators all lined up. So you'll want to also obviously have your organizational structure. So are you LLC? Are you an S Corp? Are you a C Corp? And just very broadly speaking to taxes, which is, I'm a CPA. This is what I do day in, day out. For tax liability protections, you oftentimes are starting to see a lot of C Corps in California. The reason being is that if your company goes under or undergoes an IRS audit and there's a huge adjustment because of tax code 280E, they could potentially levy the tax on the corporation itself. So C Corps are fully enclosed. Whereas if you're a pass-through entity, let's say a LLC or S Corp, and you undergo a 280E tax audit, they could potentially assess that liability onto the individual owners. That's all I'll talk about for taxes today. But if you have any questions on how to structure your company as it relates to taxes specifically, then please feel free to reach out. We'd be thrilled to help you in any way we can. So another thing that you'll want to show is obviously proof of funds or financial viability. If you're applying during the phase 2 and you only have $20,000 in the bank, that's probably not going to look in your best interest. And I do understand that a lot of pushback and a lot of feedback we get in the space is that cannabis right now is still a rich man's game. Historically, it's the people that own the buildings that have a couple $1 million in cash are generally the ones that are getting licensing. And I think how the DCR is addressing this is by implementing the social equity program. So one of the key things with regards to phase 2 is you want to show that you have a business tax certificate, right? And a valid seller's permit. It seems a bit crazy that you're registering with the city knowing that, what you're doing is potentially federally illegal, but that's one of the rules of operating in Los Angeles. And so you also want to show that you had a valid seller's permit and you're paying all sales tax. For those of you that are not on the retail front, so let's say you're a manufacturer, branded product, anything that does not sell directly to consumers, you want to always make sure that you provide people with your resale certificate. If you don't do that and you undergo a sales tax audit, they could potentially say, hey, you sold all these products to these customers, but were they actually end consumers or were they businesses? And if you didn't show compliance with the resale certificate, they could say that, hey, you owe sales tax on all your sales. And sales tax obviously varies based on city to city, but it could be upwards of 10% off your top line. So it's really, really important that if you are not a retailer, i.e. not selling to consumers, that you always provide your resale certificate. Obviously, one of the other requirements is you want to show proof of liability insurance, a summary for your security plan, a description of how you will abide by the track and trace program. And for those of you that aren't too familiar with track and trace, it's a huge beast and you have to use Metric. That was the company that scored the contract with the state of California. One of the most important things when thinking about location, if you are going to apply without a location in mind, is that you want to make sure that it abides by the zoning, right? And there's specific zoning maps that are available on Los Angeles County's website. So it's just really important before you go into a lease that you make sure that it's in the zoning areas. Potentially in putting in your lease, you might want to think about having a contingency clause, right? So you don't want to put yourself in a 1-year lease if you don't get the license. Oftentimes, the landlord may make you pay more money, for them to want to hold the building for you, they're going to double the rent until you know that you get your license, and then they can drop the rent rate down. But from a liability perspective and as an operator perspective, the worst thing you can do is stick yourself in a 1-year lease or even buy a building and not get the license. That's really kind of worst case scenario. Another thing to potentially think about if you do get the license is if the landlord would be open to a lease to purchase option. Someone once told me that if you don't own the land, you don't own the business. And that can hold very true in the cannabis space. For specific requirements, if you're a retailer, you must have the retailer plan. For delivery, you must provide a delivery plan and summary of how you'll meet all of the operational requirements. If you are a cultivator, remember they're not allowing for mixed light, but there are specific plans to operate. I would potentially think twice about doing cultivation if you are new to Los Angeles. If you already have an existing building, you've been operating there for a number of years, it obviously makes sense to stay there. But if you're thinking about going into the Los Angeles market and you're thinking about doing cultivation, I would just weigh your cost versus benefit on that just because it's so expensive. And of course, if you're a manufacturer, provide a proposed manufacturing plan and operational requirements. If you're a testing lab company, you want to make sure you have a testing plan and the plan for how you'll meet all the operational requirements. It's also really important that you get ISO certification. And then if you are a distributor, you have to provide specific distribution plans in addition to detailing how you will meet all those requirements. Regardless of which license type you're going after, you need to make sure that you are subject to the pre-licensing inspection and you check all those boxes off. And what the pre-licensing inspection includes, it includes that the DCR, building fire safety, police department, fire department, that they all come out and they sign off on your building and they sign off on how you're being structured. There's a lot of items that do require permits and there's a lot of items that don't require permits when you're thinking about updating your building. So it's just important to check with the DCR and all the associated regulatory bodies to make sure that if you have to get a permit, let's say you're adding that extra room, you're enclosing another room for your extraction facilities, that you're meeting all the required permitted requirements. The worst thing that can happen to you is if you don't get the permits, you're up and running, the city comes and they do an inspection audit and they find that you're non-compliant and they make you shut down your business until you fix it and you're non-operational for a few months. Let's briefly talk about the social equity plan. So there's specific requirements. According to the city, they're going to accept licensing based on tier 1 through tier 3. So specifically, the social equity program is LA's way of giving back to the community that was disadvantaged by the, let's say, war on drugs. One of the key points to remember is that to apply for this, you potentially have tier 1, you're arrested for a non-violent cannabis related crime. So let's say you're selling cannabis, you're cultivating it, something that was historically illegal, that's not illegal. And you also are considered low income. So what does that mean? That means your household income is roughly $41,000 or less. And you've lived in Los Angeles between 5 to 10 years in specific zip codes. And all phase 2 applicants will need to qualify into the social equity program. But if you do not fall within one of the categories, you could be paying potential fees. And what this means is that if it does not apply to you, you're not low income, you don't live in a certain neighborhood in Los Angeles, you can always partner with someone. The thing with tier 1, though, is that the social equity applicant has to have 51% ownership. When thinking about applying to tier 1, you have to really trust the person if you want to give them control of your company. Quite frankly, if you don't know the person, I don't think it's a sound thing to do just because you have no idea what they're going to do and you have no idea how compliance focused they are. Tier 2 is a little bit more interesting such that they only need to have a 33.5% ownership in the company. Again, it's a huge chunk of your company. So you have to really vet the person out and determine if you think that they'll be a good long-term fit. Tier 3, however, that's my personal favorite one. You have to show compliance that you're going to do something good for the community. So say, for example, you can rent out free office space to cannabis operators. You can host annual compliance summaries. You can do, let's say, technical training and manufacturing. There's a lot of different things that you could do to give back to the community to show compliance with the social equity program without having to give up control of your company. But I would definitely say that most people can apply as a phase 3 applicant. You just have to figure out how you want to do social good. So generally, the cannabis licensing fees will generally range from anywhere between $8,000 to $11,000 based on what application type you're going after. So retail licensing is at $9,300, where other licensing fees are set at $11,000. If you don't get your license, you can do an appeal fee. So you pay $5,000 to try them again. There are violations for non-compliance. So the zoning maps are really important to look at when you're thinking about where to set up your business. There are 10 specific zones in the city of LA that you should definitely be aware of. Some things to take into consideration is how close it is to schools, public parks, recovery centers or day centers. And of course, if you're pre-ICO, there's a lot of grandfather rules that may apply to you. So these are the different types of zoning regulations for the different types of licensing types. So specifically for manufacturers, whether it be type 6, type N, type P, there are 4 zones that you want to be aware of. If you're level 2 manufacturing type, so let's say type 7, there's another zone that you have to be aware of. And then for indoor cultivation, there's obviously a different zone that you have to be aware of. So there's a lot of operational violations and penalties that you have to be aware of. So it's really important that you either have someone on your team specifically dedicated to compliance or you outsource that function. What we're starting to see in Colorado, Washington, Oregon, states that have been around for quite a while, is that they're going back to 2013, 2014 to audit these cannabis companies. What's really sad about that is that if these companies have not been in compliance with their 280E non-deductible allocations, the IRS will assess such a big amount and then tack on penalties and interest on top of that to really push the company out of business. So it's really important that you make sure that you're aware of all the applicable taxes that you have to pay and you make sure that you're making those payments on a timely manner. Otherwise, the potential penalties plus interest could be really detrimental to your business. And of course, here are some specific operating procedures and then various other violational penalties and things that you have to be aware of. Here's some serious offenses. Only use the name and business as stated on the license. Make sure that, if you do have DBAs, that it's well established, that you don't set up as a certain entity and then you operate as another. Do not sublet any of the premise without written approval from the DCR. One of the things that's really important for phase 2 applicants is that if you apply with your license type and you don't get it, the city has authority to shut you down. It's a kind of gamble in the rub of phase 2, such that you want to come clean, you want to apply, but all of a sudden you go for a license, you throw yourself out there and they say, hey, this is not zoned, this is not done correctly. They have the authority at that time to shut you down. So just make sure when you're going to apply that whomever you're working with understands all the rules to make sure that if you don't get it, it doesn't financially cripple your business. So with that, here's our website. We are GreenGrowth CPAs. For those of you who've been following our content, we were historically called California Cannabis CPA, but we had to do name brand because we started getting a lot of clients outside of California. So we're now called GreenGrowth CPAs. So with that, I know that was a lot of information and I know that there's a lot of